Among the ancient civilizations of the world, Greece is one of those who left us with quite a bit of written records, and this is a good thing. We know quite a lot about ancient Greece, but the great thing is, there's so much more left to find out. They're famed for their rich history, cultural achievements. One just needs to take a walk through modern-day Athens, you can see it's still standing. But among all of those ruins lie mysteries that have perplexed people for centuries. From the secret religious rites, the undeciphered scripts, and those lost treasures, there's many a facet of this distant past that still remains quite shrouded in mystery. And so today, that's what we're going to talk about. The unsolved mysteries of ancient Greece. We've already done Rome and Egypt, so why not continue on? Well, each mystery is kind of a glimpse into the gaps in our knowledge, puzzles and things like that archaeologists and scholars continue to investigate, and of course, we must keep an open mind with some of the theories. Not everything is set in stone yet, and while we'll try and avoid the more outlandish theories, we will try to explain everything on equal footing, as who knows what evidence we're going to dig out of the ground next. So let me welcome you to the channel first. If you're a newcomer here, I invite you to hit the subscribe button, and if you're coming back, well, good to see you again. Also, you get no ads throughout the breadth of this video, all uninterrupted, which is pretty good. This is all due to us being supported by the Patreon, YouTube members, the merch store, the few little ancient Greek goodies on there, and also the occasional donation. That is through the Super Thanks and the PayPal link. If you're interested in any of those links, well, you can find them in the pinned comment or in the video and channel description. Now, with all that being said, let's get on to the video for today. The unsolved mysteries of ancient Greece. Well, I suppose we should start from the most enigmatic of the mysteries, that is of the Delphic Oracle. Now, I've spoken about this in more detail in the Oracle of Delphi video, and just in general the other oracles of Greece, because it wasn't just the Delphic Oracle, but we're going to give a little bit more credence to the, I suppose, the more theoretical parts of things in this video, since this is the mysteries video. It's perhaps one of the most mystifying institutions in all of ancient Greece. You see, for thousands of years, Greeks from all walks of life, as from farmers to soldiers all the way up to emperors, traveled to the sacred site on Mount Parnassus to consult the god Apollo's prophetess. This prophetess, of course, was called the Pythia. Now, the Pythia would sit atop a tripod in the temple's inner chamber and enter a kind of trance-like state before delivering Apollo's pronouncements. We know this from the ancient writer Plutarch, who himself actually served as a priest at Delphi. The oracle never gave simple answers. Instead, she spoke in riddles and allegories with hidden meanings and ambiguities. Of course, this leaves the petitioner to interpret the true message. Is a classic example. We get it from Herodotus, the prophecy given to King Croesus of Lydia. The oracle declared that if Croesus attacked the Persian Empire, he would, quote, destroy a great empire. Well, of course, you can take that for what you will, and Croesus, of course, perhaps with a little confirmation bias, went to war quite encouraged, only to find out that the empire that was going to be destroyed was his own. Cryptic answers, of course, often only understood in hindsight. It's a very, well, it sounds like something out of a Greek tragedy, doesn't it? In any case, it contributed to the Delphic Oracle's reputation and enduring mystery In any case, the ancient observers, they grappled with how the Pythia reached these prophecies, and everyone had their own theories on that. Plutarch noted the presence of a sweet-smelling pneuma, that is, a vapor rising from a chasm in the temple floor, and that suggests that Apollo's inspiration might literally be in the air. While some modern scholars once doubted this story as legend, geological studies at Delphi have uncovered fissures in the earth and residues of gases like ethylene, that is a sweet-scented gas. Problem is, the ethylene can induce trance and euphoria, so you best be careful with that. These findings certainly lend credence to the idea that the Pythia's ecstatic state might have actually been triggered by natural fumes seeping from the underground. However, despite the scientific insights coming along once again to ruin all the mystery and fun, I'm afraid, much still remains quite unsolved. You see, we still do not know exactly what combination of substances the oracle inhaled. Various proposals range from the aforementioned ethylene to carbon dioxide and methane. And we also don't know the precise mechanism by which the temple priests managed the oracle's sessions. So did the Pythia babble incoherently under the influence of the vapors, with attending priests then translating her utterances into an elegant poetic verse? Ancient accounts certainly seem to suggest as much. They describe the Pythia raving, while priests transcribed the words into hexameter verse. But once again, the details are pretty scarce on that one. The Delphic oracle, thus, remains quite an enigma at the intersection of science and religion. But it is fascinating, though. It fascinates historians and scientists alike. An ancient practice where divine inspiration might have had a very earthly explanation. Yet until we uncover more evidence, the full secret of how the Oracle of Delphi delivered her prophecies continues to get away from us. And it reminds us that even in a well-documented culture like Greece, some phenomena were kept mysterious quite deliberately. And of course, we can't go past the mysteries of ancient Greece without the mysteries of ancient Greece. And what I mean by this, of course, is the Eleusinian mysteries. Literally given us the word, to be honest. It was a mystery so well kept that it just seeped into our modern vocabulary. These were basically secret initiation ceremonies held in honor of the goddess Demeter and Persephone at Eleusis, a town that's quite close to Athens. For nearly 2,000 years, initiates from across the Greek world and later the Roman world, and perhaps other places, participated in these yearly rites, which promised spiritual benefits, possibly including a hope for a better fate after death. Yet what exactly transpired during the ceremonies, that is still an unsolved puzzle, because the participants were sworn to absolute secrecy. To reveal the sacred proceedings was a capital offense under Athenian law, and remarkably, this vow of silence was largely kept. As a result, us modern observers have to piece together clues from a couple archaeological remains here, a few fragmentary sources there, but we know full well that the most important things were never written down. I know, it's a shame, but there's still a little bit to be gleaned, I suppose. What do we know about it? Well, we know that they were split into the lesser and greater mysteries, with the greater initiation taking place in the fall and involving a multi-day journey from Athens to Eleusis. Ancient descriptions speak of processions of worshippers carrying torches, fasting and then drinking a special barley and mint drink called kykeon, and performing, of course, recitations, dances, things like this. Of course, the crescendo occurred at night in the Telesterion, a great hall at Eleusis, where the highest secrets were revealed by the priests, the content of which has never been explicitly recorded. But some later writers have hinted at what might have been seen. Perhaps a sacred object was shown. An enigmatic description refers to an ear of grain cut in silence, symbolizing the cycle of life and rebirth, central to the Demeter and Persephone myth. Initiates likely witnessed a dramatic reenactment of Persephone's descent into the underworld and return to the earth, a powerful myth of death and rebirth. The Roman statesman Cicero, who was initiated at Eleusis, lauded the mysteries as the pinnacle of Greek religion, writing that Athens had given nothing finer to the world. Through these rites, he said, people, quote, learned the fundamentals of life and gained the knowledge not just to live happily, but also to die with a better hope. Of course, this suggests that initiates would have somehow experienced some kind of profound spiritual reassurance. Well, there's a few clues for you, and maybe you've got an image in your mind of what's going on. I suppose everyone's going to imagine it differently. But despite all these clues, the precise sequence of events and the ultimate revelation remains unknown. As for the scholars, they theorize quite boldly. One modern theory even proposes that the Kikeon drink was laced with ergot, a fungus containing a potent hallucinogen related to LSD, to induce a visionary state in the initiates. That's probably going to get the job done. Well, this psychedelic hypothesis is quite speculative, but if it is true, it might explain the transcendent experiences participants reported. Others point out the psychological power of the communal ritual in a dark hall, with torches, music, and the sudden unveiling of sacred symbols. Could itself, perhaps, have altered consciousness without the need for any stimulants. Of course, we're left with these tantalizing testimonies too. Initiates uniformly praise the experience. But when they were asked about what it was actually like, they refused to divulge in any sort of detail. They would only tell people that you have to go and do it for yourself. It can't be explained. It can only be felt. It can only be experienced. Of course, the mysteries stopped once Christianity came around. That was around the late 4th century CE, and Christianized Roman Empire officials finally closed the pagan sanctuaries. And with their ending, the secret was all lost. Today, archaeologists excavating Eleusis can identify the Grand Telesterion Hall and the cave behind, believed to be the entrance to Hades in the myth. But these stones are silent. They don't tell us any stories. Nothing about what truly happened on those very mysterious nights. And so they remain unsolved, in the most literal sense, a religious secret that antiquity kept to itself. But it challenges us to imagine a ritual that transformed thousands of lives, but left just barely a whisper of its content in the historical record. Perhaps we'll never know. And, well, I suppose they never wanted us to anyway. Well, on to the next mystery. And not all mysteries are so grandiose. Some come from the scribes. And while classical Greek literature has come down to us in quite a bit of abundance, there are writings from the ancient world that stubbornly resist our efforts of translation. Now, chief among these is Linear A, the script used by the Minoan civilization of Crete during the 2nd millennium BCE, and the enigmatic Phaistos disc, uniquely transcribed clay. Well, these represent mysteries of language and communication, messages from ancient Crete that still remain untranslated to this very day. Now let's talk about the Minoans for a while. They flourished on Crete in the Bronze Age, so we're going back quite a while. Around 2000 to 1400 BCE, they erected palaces and developed an advanced society. In fact, you could even say they were contemporaneous with ancient Egypt and Babylonia. They left behind numerous clay tablets and inscriptions in a writing system that we have dubbed Linear A, so named by archaeologist Arthur Evans, by the way, who discovered it, because the characters are arranged in lines, so linear. In any case, Linear A's symbols are elegantly abstract, and they clearly represent some syllabic writing system, but the language it encodes is unknown. All attempts to decipher Linear A have been inconclusive, largely because we lack a bilingual text, or a large enough corpus to crack its patterns. But what frustrates scholars is that Linear A's immediate successor, Linear B, has been deciphered. And guess what? It turned out to encode an earlier form of Greek used by the Mycenaean civilization on the mainland and Crete after about 1450. The decipherment of Linear B in the 1950s by Michael Ventris was a triumph of linguistic detective work, up there with the Rosetta Stone and cuneiform, revealing inventories and records of the Mycenaean palaces. Yet Linear B was quite obviously adapted from Linear A, and the two scripts share many signs. Now this raises the question, why can we read Linear B, but not Linear A? There's an answer, and that answer lies in the underlying language. You see, Linear B encodes Greek, which scholars could eventually recognize. Linear A appears to encode a non-Greek language, and that is presumably the native Minoan tongue. And we've just got no other examples. A language isolate. Thus, even though we can sound out some Linear A texts phonetically, those sounds don't correspond to any known language. Until a lucky find, perhaps a Minoan inscription, accompanied with a translation in Akkadian or Egyptian, for instance, provides a key, Linear A likely will remain an undeciphered mystery. We pretty much have to find something akin to a Rosetta Stone, this kind of thing. So for now, we can only guess at the content of the Minoan records. Maybe temple offerings, trade transactions. If we're lucky, we'll get some hymns to goddesses, maybe even some old stories. Who knows? But early writing systems generally are a little dry in their contents. In any case, it's locked behind a script that we cannot understand. Now, speaking of things we cannot understand, if Linear A is a broad linguistic mystery, the Phaistos disk is a more singular puzzle, literally a one-of-a-kind artifact. It was discovered in 1908 in the ruins of a Minoan palace of Phaistos. This baked clay disc, around 15 centimeters across, is stamped on both sides with a spiral of strange symbols. There are 45 distinct signs depicting objects like humans, animals, plants, and abstract designs repeated in various combinations. In fact, there is 241 impressions in total. The creator of the disc, whoever that was, impressively used movable stamps to press each sign into the clay. An early example of printing, if we want to put it that way, quite unique in the ancient world. But what does it say? What does it all mean? The symbols don't clearly match any other known script, though some resemble Linear A or Egyptian hieroglyphs in a general sense. Others we have to do a little bit of stretching and imagination for. Scholars have proposed countless interpretations. Some believe the disc is a hymn or a prayer. Others think it's a kind of board game, a calendrical chart, maybe even a simple nursery rhyme. Well, decipherers have read it as everything from a dedicatory text to a tale of adventure. But there's no consensus whatsoever, and many theories rely on considerable imagination. Now, because the Phidias disc stands alone, no second copy or related text to compare, verifying any hypothesis is extraordinarily difficult. Well, we don't know what language it might represent. It could be the Minoan language in a unique pictographic form, perhaps, or a language from elsewhere that found its way to Crete. Some experts have even mused whether the disc might be a forgery by the ancient scribes of Phidias, perhaps a teaching tool or a clever puzzle, perhaps just some bored scholar making up a language of his own. Who knows? But its mystery deepens when we consider that the disc was carefully fired, suggesting that it was meant to be preserved, not just a disposable record. So was it a sacred object? Perhaps something of some cult, a mystery of Crete, kind of like the Eleusinian mysteries. A cryptographic message, perhaps? We just don't know. In any case, over a century after its discovery, the disc remains an undeciphered artifact, and it teases us with the possibility that meaningful text lies just beyond our reach and understanding. I suppose together, Linear A and the Phidias disc remind us that there are whole chapters of Greek prehistoric life, particularly the Minoans, that are still mute to us, pending the discovery of a Greek Rosetta Stone that will unlock their words. But until then, these mysteries continue to prompt debate and inspire would-be code breakers. But that keeps alive a hope that one day we might literally read a new page of history. Who knows? Perhaps somebody watching this now will be the one to finally translate Linear A or figure out the Phidias disc. Don't write yourself off. You could do it. Just try what I'm gonna do. Okay, so moving on. We talk about Thera and Atlantis. You see, around 1600 BCE, there was a catastrophic event that shook the Aegean world. The explosive eruption of the volcanic Thera, present-day Santorini. This was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history, up there with Pompeii, Krakatoa, all the rest. The island's center blasted apart, sending ash clouds high into the atmosphere and generating tsunamis that likely struck nearby coastlines. The thriving Minoan settlement on Thera was buried in pumice, preserved today at the archaeological site of Akrotiri, sometimes called a Bronze Age Pompeii. The wider impacts of this eruption on the Minoan civilization of Crete are still debated. Did this cataclysm directly cause the downfall of the Minoans, or did it simply weaken them? We're not sure, but what we know is that within about a century of the eruption, by around 1450, the great Minoan palaces on Crete were either abandoned or destroyed, possibly taken over by Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. And so the collapse of Minoan culture is a mystery intertwined with Thera's eruption. Natural disaster, internal turmoil, and the foreign invasions might have all played a role. But what intrigues many is the possible link between this real prehistoric disaster and that of one of the most enduring legends of Western tradition. And that is the lost island of Atlantis. You see, the story of Atlantis comes not from Bronze Age records, but from the Greek philosopher Plato, who wrote about it in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, around 360 BCE. According to Plato, Atlantis was the powerful island empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Now that is, i.e., beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, that in distance and antiquity had waged war on the known world. Now the gods weren't too happy about this. They punished Atlantis for its hubris by sending earthquakes and floods that sank the island beneath the sea in a single day and night. Plato's account is detailed, describing a grand capital city with concentric rings of land and sea, yet he presents it as a story told by Egyptian priests to the Athenian lawmaker Solon, and he uses it to illustrate philosophical points about ideal societies and the fate of empires, I suppose. But importantly, Plato places the fall of Atlantis at 9,000 years before Solon's time. Now that's a date that would have been about 9600 BCE, long before any known advanced civilizations, and long before any record-keeping, that's for sure. These aspects strongly suggest that Atlantis was intended as a fictional or symbolic tale. But the tantalizing parallels to the Thera eruption have prompted speculation for generations that Plato's myth was inspired, perhaps indirectly, by memories of the Minoan collapse. Consider this. The Minoans were a great seafaring civilization. Their prominent island, Crete, along with Thera, suffered devastation from natural forces. Although Crete itself did not sink, luckily for them, the island of Thera literally imploded, leaving a caldera now filled by the sea, a sunken island, as it were. So it was not hard to imagine that centuries later, distant echoes of this Bronze Age cataclysm might have reached Egypt or Greece in the form of a legendary sunken kingdom tale. Is Atlantis, therefore, a distorted memory of the Thera eruption, and of course the Minoan downfall? Many scholars find that to be quite plausible. If an Egyptian priest in 600 BCE had some records or oral tales of a great island of the north destroyed by earthquakes and flood, the story could have been embellished and passed on to Solon, and then relayed to Plato's circle. The dramatic details in Plato's narrative, an island engulfed by the sea, a once great civilization, once virtuous, now becoming corrupt, could be a morality tale woven around a kernel of true disaster. However, the fact remains that Plato is our only source on Atlantis for now, and he may well have invented it outright as an allegory, a kind of philosophical agitprop. No unequivocal archaeological evidence of a sunk Atlantis has ever been found, despite numerous expeditions and fringe theories placing Atlantis everywhere from Spain to even all the way up to Antarctica. Santorini's ruins at Akrotiri show a society halted in its tracks by eruption, but they correspond to the Minoan Crete culture, not a radically separate empire. Thus the mystery of Atlantis endures largely because it bridges myth and history. We are left with a set of intriguing coincidences rather than actual proof. The Thera eruption certainly happened. No one's doubting that. It was certainly devastating. Now that's a historical fact. But whether it is the seed of Plato's fable is an open question that scholars continue to debate. Atlantis, as an unsolved mystery, teaches us caution. It's a story that has launched countless imaginative claims. But responsible inquiry requires sifting through myth from possible reality. So for now, Atlantis remains elusive to us, a utopian fiction for many, but for others, a sign that behind Greek myths there sometimes lurks memories of real events, so dramatic that they echo down the ages, albeit with changed names and places. Now, not long after the time of the Thera eruption and the end of the Minoan dominance, another great upheaval struck the Aegean. Around 1200, the civilization of the Mycenaeans, that is the first Greeks, by the way, who built the palaces and left the written records in Linear B, fell into ruin. The imposing citadels at Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and other sites were destroyed or abandoned. The art of writing was lost. trade dwindled. A Greek dark age, lasting several centuries. Not a good time for anyone involved, that's for sure. But the question was, of what caused the collapse of Mycenaean civilization? And that's one of the most enduring puzzles of ancient history, not just for Greece, but for the entire Eastern Mediterranean. You see, it was part of the broader Late Bronze Age collapse, period of widespread turmoil that also saw the end of the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the sacking of cities in the Levant, and the decline of Egypt's power. It is as if around 1200 BCE, the civilized world just came crashing down. Why did it happen? Well, just in a general sense, there's a few contributing factors. First of all, is invasions or the migration of outside peoples, such as the Sea Peoples, who are recorded as attacking Egypt and other regions around the time, or the influx of new Greek tribes, i.e. the Dorians, for example, moving southward. There's also natural disasters, like a cluster of earthquakes or prolonged droughts that led to famine and instability. And then there's the general internal social upheaval, such as peasant revolts, civil wars. The disruption of trade routes and economic systems didn't help either. The Bronze Age world was interconnected, with tin and copper for making bronze shipped over long distances. If these key trade networks collapsed due to war or other factors, the economic shock could destabilize the whole known world. Of course, evidence exists for all of these factors, and I've covered it in more detail in a more general Bronze Age collapse video if you look in the Bronze Age playlists. I also just did one about the Sea Peoples too about a month ago, if you're interested. But in terms of Greece, the layers of destruction and fire are evident at many archaeological sites around 1200. Weapons and fortifications found from that period indicate increased warfare. Egyptian inscriptions, notably on the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III, describe invasions of foreign raiders, a confederation of sea peoples causing havoc across the eastern Mediterranean. Now, some of these sea peoples have been tentatively linked by scholars to groups in the Aegean. For instance, a group called the Denyen might relate to the Greek Danans, that is another name for the Greeks. Meanwhile, climatological studies of pollen and sediment suggest a severe drought struck the region in the late 13th century, which could have, of course, induced famine and mass migrations. Of course, it's easy to see these calamities feeding off each other, crop failures leading to unrest and the movement of peoples, which in turn sparks wars, and it cuts off trade, topples cities, all the rest. Chaos usually snowballs like that. But the ancient Greeks themselves, looking back on what we now call the Greek Dark Age from around 1100 to 800 BCE, had their own explanation. The Dorian invasion, or the return of the Heraclidae. This legend held that a generation or two after the Trojan War, the descendants of the hero Heracles, that is Heraclidae, allied with the Dorian tribe, swept into southern Greece and reclaimed the lands of their ancestors, conquering the Mycenaean strongholds. Herodotus and Thucydides both mention these events in passing as a change that reshaped early Greece. Thucydides even provides a timeline saying that the Dorians came about 80 years after the fall of Troy. Now, for a long time, historians took this legend as a kernel of truth. Perhaps a real migration of Dorian Greek-speaking peoples came from the north, brought down the old Achaean kingdoms. However, more recent scholarship has been a little bit more skeptical. While there are signs of new pottery styles and iron weaponry emerging in post-1200 Greece, possibly indicating newcomers, it's unclear if this was an armed invasion, or rather a slower process of cultural change. However, the Dorian invasion's legend might have been a later construct to explain differences between dialects in classical Greece. That is, the Dorians versus the Ionian Greeks, rather than anything based in any real factual memory. To sum it up, the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization remains unsolved, as a precise event at least. But the outline we have is of a complex systems failure. The Mycenaeans' fall plunged Greece into a centuries-long era of smaller villages, waning population, and loss of arts like writing and large-scale building. It was only until 750 did the Greek society finally revive, with the adoption of the Phoenician alphabet and the rise of city-states. What happened in the interim was largely forgotten or mythologized by the Greeks of classical times. Modern archaeology and interdisciplinary research continue to piece together this dark puzzle, combining textual hints, ruins, and environmental data. But we still might never get a smoking gun for the late Bronze Age collapse in Greece. But as new evidence emerges, like signs of ancient drought or analysis of skeletons indicating warfare, we get closer to understanding the confluence of factors that ended Greece's golden age, or at least the first one. Now that's a sobering reminder too, that even advanced societies can prove fragile. One thread gets cut, the whole thing comes tumbling down. Who knows what kind of chaos awaits after that kind of collapse? Historical mysteries can have multiple overlapping answers rather than a simple dramatic cause, and often the story's a lot more complicated than we first will begin to think. But few tales from antiquity are as storied as the next one, the Trojan War. Immortalized in Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and Odyssey, the war was said to have been fought by an alliance of Greek kings against the city of Troy, sparked by the abduction of the infamously beautiful Helen, the Spartan queen, the face that launched 1,000 ships. Well, for the ancient Greeks, the Trojan War was a cornerstone of their heroic past, a saga of honor, wrath, and the whims of the gods. But the modern observer asks, did it actually happen? And if it did, what were the real events behind the legend of Achilles, Hector, the wooden horse? The historicity of the Trojan War remains an open question, a mystery that sits at the crossroad of archaeology, mythology, and the most boring of textual analysis. For a long time, scholars in the West doubted that Troy even existed at all, considering it perhaps purely myth. But that changed in the 19th century, when archaeologists guided by Homer's descriptions discovered a large ancient city at Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey. Pioneered by Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s, excavations revealed multiple layers of a settlement that had been inhabited over many centuries. One layer in particular, often identified as Troy 7, dated around 1200 BCE, shows evidence of destruction by war. So could these be the ruins of the very city that the Greeks besieged in those old stories? Many scholars now believe that Homeric Troy corresponds to a real city that did experience violent upheaval around the time the legend suggests the war took place. But the consensus is that there likely was a conflict, or several conflicts, between the late Mycenaean Greeks and the inhabitants of the region of Troy known as Troas, perhaps involving a siege of a city in that location. The scale and details, however, were almost certainly smaller and different than the epics suggest, which, if you know Greek history and Greek epics, you expect that as a matter of course. But what evidence supports a historical kernel for the Trojan War? Apart from the archaeological signs of destruction at Troy, we've also got Hittite texts from the same era, which intriguingly mention a place called Wilusa, very likely the Hittite name for Troy, which and we know that because Wilusa is phonetically similar to the Greek Ilios or Ilion, Homer's name for Troy, that is. These documents also reference a king of Ahiawa, which most scholars interpret as the Hittite term for the Mycenaean Greek king, possibly referring to Achaeans of Homer. In one Hittite letter, there is talk of tensions or raids involving Wilusa and the Ahiawa. In another, a treaty is made with a ruler named Alexander of Wilusa, and intriguingly, if you caught it, Alexander is linguistically akin to Alexandros, which in Greek is the alternate name of Paris, the Trojan prince who took Helen. Such correspondence suggests that the Greeks and the Hittites had diplomatic and perhaps adversarial reactions over northwestern Anatolia, and that names resembling those in legend have appeared in real records. And that is indeed a stunning convergence of myth and archive together. A Trojan prince named Alexander, a city that sounds like Ilios, foreign Achaean aggressors. It all hints that the Homeric story preserved some distant memory of actual people and events, albeit through a very distorted lens. However, you can imagine that separating fact from fiction is extraordinarily difficult. The Iliad, composed orally around the 8th century and written down later, is a product of centuries of storytelling evolution. By the time Homer's version took shape, any historical war would have been 400 to 500 years in the past, akin to us today recalling events of the medieval era through only folk ballads. Homer's account is full of divine interventions, heroic single combats, and anachronisms. His Bronze Age heroes sometimes use iron weapons, or fight in ways more typical of Homer's own era, phalanxes and all that sort of thing, tortoise formations. But this tells us that the epics are not a journalistic report, but rather a blend of various war traditions and poetic invention. Thus the mystery of the Trojan War boils down to which elements, if any, are historical. Was there a real Helen? Was there a real Achilles? Most likely not in the way described, but perhaps there was someone with that name or something akin to that concept. The figures seem to be archetypal, but there could have been a warlord in Greece who led a coalition against the rebellious city of Troy as part of the turbulent events of the late Bronze Age. The war might have been one episode within the larger collapse mentioned earlier, perhaps linked to movements of peoples or rivalries over trade routes or control of the Dardanelles Strait. Now, the unsolved part of this mystery is that the archaeological evidence, while supportive of a conflict, cannot confirm any of the narrative details, and the written records from that time, Hittite text that is, are too scant to draw a full picture. For instance, we have no ancient Trojan account of the war, only the Greek side's later mythologized memory. It is conceivable that the memory of such a siege was handed down orally and amplified over generations into the epic cycle that we know. The Trojan horse, famously used to deceive and capture the city, is almost certainly a later myth. Archaeology can't confirm any giant wooden horses in the area, but who knows, perhaps we just haven't found it yet. Some have suggested that it might allegorize an earthquake. You see, Poseidon was the god of earthquakes, and also associated with horses, so a horse perhaps could be metaphorically Poseidon shaking the walls down. Or perhaps a siege engine. They just called it a giant horse, who knows? Speculative interpretations of a poetic symbol, but it's worth engaging in a bit of speculation, I suppose, when we don't know the complete facts. In any case, the Trojan War's historicity remains partly in the realm of educated guesswork. Many historians take a middle ground. Troy was real and destroyed in the war, but the Trojan War as we know it is a fusion of various wars and mythic themes. Thus the war is neither pure fiction nor simple fact. It's a legendary narrative grown around a hardened core of truth. Unraveling that exact truth, that's an ongoing scholarly detective game. Each discovery, like the Hittite references or new finds at Troy, adds a piece to the puzzle that hasn't been solved entirely yet. In any case, the allure lies in its dual nature. It's both a cornerstone of Western literature and also a historical question mark. The Greeks themselves were divided on it. For example, Herodotus believed the war happened, though he relays a variant that Helen actually stayed in Egypt during the war, whereas some later philosophers thought that the epics were just complete allegories. In any case, today we have to rely on archaeology. Unfortunately, we can lean toward believing in a real conflict. But that debate is far from settled. So what is certain is that the story of Troy will continue to captivate, that's for sure. In part because it asks us to confront the boundary between history and myth. And that boundary in this case remains frustratingly blurry. Well, if the Trojan War was a mystery of events, the Homeric question is a mystery of authorship. It's quite simply put, who was Homer? The poet, or poets, to whom the Iliad and Odyssey are attributed? How were these monumental epics composed? By whom and when? We have a name, but we don't have a face. This might seem like a more literary puzzle than a historical one, but it's deeply connected with the history of the early Greek culture and writing. Ancient tradition presents Homer as a single individual, a blind bard from Ionia, that is the coast of Anatolia, who lived sometime between the 12th and 8th centuries BCE, depending on which source one reads, of course. Various cities claim to be his birthplace, Chios and Smyrna among them. There were even fanciful biographies. One legend describes Homer as a wandering poet who was blind and begged for a living. Another as a schoolmaster who turned to poetry. The very name, Homer, might not have been a personal name originally. Some suggest it could mean hostage or blind in dialect, hinting at a symbolic label. But we simply have no contemporary record of a man named Homer. By the time we have historical authors referencing Homer, say Herodotus in the 5th century or Aristotle in the 4th, Homer had become a quasi-mythical figure, revered as a great ancestor of Greek literature. Herodotus guessed that Homer lived around 400 years before his own time, which would place Homer around 850. A pretty reasonable estimate, I suppose, but at the end of the day, still an educated guess at best. But the core of the Homeric question lies in the nature of the epics themselves. Linguistic and textual analysis has shown that the Iliad and the Odyssey likely originated in an oral tradition of epic poetry. Before writing was common, you see, professional bards called aodoi would recite long heroic tales from memory, often singing them to the accompaniment of a lyre. They employed a special poetic language, and many repeated formulaic phrases to aid in composition and memorization. In the early 20th century, scholars demonstrated by studying living oral bards in the Balkans that such oral poets could spontaneously compose epic-length songs using formulas and themes. This research illuminated why Homer's texts have so much repeated lines and epithets, the hallmarks of oral composition. But it also suggested that the Homeric poems might have been shaped over generations by multiple poets, gradually growing and evolving until reaching the form that we have today. So if that is true, then who exactly wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey? The prevailing theory is that these epics were the product of a long oral tradition and were likely first written down in the 7th or 8th century BCE, when the Greeks finally adopted the alphabet. Possibly there was a gifted bard, whom we might perhaps call Homer, who performed a particularly authoritative version of these epics. And then that version, of course, being the most popular one, was decided upon and transcribed. Or perhaps the texts were compiled by scholars from the oral repertoire of several bards. There is even the possibility that Homer was not a single person at all, but rather just a stand-in name for a collective tradition of epic singers. Ancient scholars in Hellenistic times noted inconsistencies between Iliad and Odyssey works, and argued that the two might have had different authors. A minority view, but it shows the question is still very old. The Iliad is often considered more unified and archaic in style, whereas the Odyssey has a somewhat later feel and different focus. War versus homecoming. Could one person have composed both, perhaps at different ages? Yeah, it's possible. A genius poet could certainly have had a long career, but it's also possible that a school of poets was involved. Another layer of mystery comes from the so-called Homeridae, a clan or guild of rhapsodes in Chios in antiquity who claimed descent from Homer and acted as preservers of his poetry. Now their existence hints that the poems were transmitted and perhaps edited by generations of reciters. By the 6th century BC, the Athenian ruler Pisistratus is said to have commissioned a standard written edition of Homer's epics to use in festivals, implying that even before then there were variants in circulation. Now this editing might have fixed the text, but who provided the text in the first place? Possibly the Homeridae or other oral sources. In any case, despite the centuries of scholarship, we cannot definitively say who Homer was. Many have concluded that asking for a single biographical Homer is the wrong approach. Instead, Homer symbolizes the poetic tradition that gave birth to the epics. And yet, the idea of a brilliant author refuses to die, because the Iliad and the Odyssey are such cohesive and artful works in their final forms. They have intricate plots, deep characterization, and that feels like the stamp of a single genius. It may be that an exceptionally talented poet at the end of the oral tradition wove together existing tales into grand narratives, imposing a unifying vision, and if so, that person's identity is now lost to time. Beyond the name Homer, scholars continue to analyze the language and structure of the epics for clues. For instance, noting that the Odyssey might reference events that occurred later than the Iliad, implying it could be a later composition. The subtleties fuel the ongoing debates about whether one mind or multiple shaped the epics. Well, away from literature now, but still within the realm of art, we have the lost fate of the statues of Phidias. Now, who was Phidias? Well, he was a sculptor in the golden age of classical Greece, and he created some of the wonders of the ancient world, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, and the Athena Parthenos in Athens. These masterpieces, both made around the 5th century BCE, were dazzling creations of gold and ivory. Well, he would do this over wooden frameworks. Don't think that the entire thing was solid gold. Still impressive, but hey. Well, they stood as symbols of Greek religious devotion and artistic genius. Yet despite their fame, neither statue survives today. They vanished in late antiquity under uncertain circumstances. The disappearance of these wonders is an unsolved historical question, illustrating how even great treasures can be lost without a clear record. Phidias' Zeus at Olympia was created around 435 BCE for the Temple of Zeus in Olympia, where the Olympic Games were held. According to ancient descriptions, especially a detailed account by Pausanias, a 2nd century CE travel writer, the statue depicted the king of the gods seated on an elaborate throne. It stood roughly 12 meters or 40 feet tall, so large that, as the saying went, if Zeus were to stand up, he would unroof the temple. The god's flesh was rendered in ivory plates, giving a lifelike paleness, while his robe and ornaments were of gleaming gold. In his hands he held a figure of Nike, that is, victory, and a scepter with an eagle, both symbolic. The throne was inlaid with ebony, ivory, and precious stones portraying mythical scenes. The overall effect left viewers awestruck. It was said that when Phidias was asked what inspired his Zeus, he cited lines of Homer describing Zeus's majesty, and then he made it visible. But the mystery lies at the end. The temple of Zeus at Olympia eventually fell into disuse with the rise of Christianity, and the Olympic Games were suppressed in the late 4th century too. One story holds that the great statue was destroyed by fire when the temple itself burned down in 408. However, another tradition claims a different fate, that the statue of Zeus was transported to Constantinople earlier in the 4th or early 5th century to save it or adorn a palace. There it supposedly became part of a collection of pagan artworks owned by a wealthy official named Lausus. This collection of antiquities was known to include other famous statues of Greek gods. But in 475, a terrible fire swept through Constantinople, gutting the palace of Lausus and presumably destroying the artworks within, possibly including the Zeus statue of Phidias. A Byzantine chronicler centuries later lamented the glory of the Greeks perishing in those flames. But we are left uncertain as to which version is true. Did Zeus burn in Olympia or Constantinople? No remnants of the statue have ever been identified. Only small clues, like coins or gems that bear the images of it. And Pausanias' description gives us a sense of its appearance. But either way, by the late 5th century CE, the great statue of Zeus was gone. Its disappearance was not well recorded by contemporaries. And that's probably because by then it represented the old pagan world, whose loss the new Christian authorities did not really see as a very big thing to mourn. Phidias' other marvel, the Athena Parthenos, stood in the Parthenon of the Acropolis of Athens. Completed around 447 BCE, the statue of the city's patron goddess Athena was similarly huge, about 11 to 12 meters tall, so once again about 40 feet, and likewise made of ivory and gold. Athena was portrayed standing, armed with a spear and shield, and holding a small statue of Nike in her outstretched hand. The amount of gold on her, perhaps over 1,000 kilograms, was so great that it was treated as a kind of treasury reserve for Athens. The gold plates were designed to be removable in case the city needed to melt them down for coinage. In fact, historical records indicate that they did remove and test the gold at least once during a financial crisis. Well, this shows how valuable and symbolic the statue really was. Tourists in Roman times marveled at the Athena Parthenos. Pausanias describes her with rich detail, noting the Sphinx on her helmet and the battle of Amazons depicted on her shield. But what became of the Athena Parthenos? Here the trail is even fainter. By the late Roman period, the Parthenon had been converted into a Christian church, and clearly the pagan cult statue would have been removed or destroyed in that process. One theory is that, like Zeus, that Athena was relocated to Constantinople during the 5th century to preserve it, or possibly taken earlier by a Roman emperor's loot or display, a kind of reward. So if it did reach Constantinople, it likely met the same end, consumed in one of those great fires that periodically ravaged the city, or perhaps destroyed during the fervor of Christian iconoclasm. There were edicts, by the way, to destroy the idols of the old gods. A lot of things got whipped up with that. But another possibility is that it never left Athens, but was dismantled or looted when the Parthenon became a church. The gold, being immensely valuable, would have been stripped off. The ivory would decay or burn easily. There is a late antiquity anecdote that a statue of Athena was decapitated and mutilated by Christians, but we lack clear references. By medieval times, we do know that nothing remained of Athena's great statue. Thus, both of the masterpieces of Phidias vanished, leaving almost not a single physical trace. Archaeologists have found the workshop at Olympia where Phidias sculpted Zeus, including molds and tools, even perhaps a cup inscribed, "I belong to Phidias," but not a splinter of the statue itself. Back in Athens, occasional fragments of sculpture on the Acropolis surface, but nothing attributable to the Parthenos. The mystery here is partly one of the fate, and partly one of the reconstruction. We ask how exactly were these statues lost, and is there any hope of some fragment survived unidentified? Additionally, can we ever fully envision them as they were? For example, scholars debate details of their appearance. We have later marble copy statuettes believed to imitate the Athena Parthenos at small scale, but they may not capture the full splendor or colors of the original. Both statues had likely painted details and inlays that, unfortunately, now only exist in our imagination. Well, perhaps it's subjective toward the viewer's sensibilities, but I think I've saved the most interesting one to last. That is the Antikythera Mechanism. This takes us back to 1901. Divers off the coast of a tiny Greek island of Antikythera made an astounding discovery in an ancient shipwreck, a corroded lump of bronze that upon closer examination turned out to contain an intricate assembly of gears. Little did anyone realize at first that this artifact would become known as the famous Antikythera Mechanism, sometimes hailed as the first known analog computer. Now let me explain. Dating to around the 1st century BC, the mechanism was eventually understood to be a device for tracking astronomical cycles, capable of predicting precise positions of the sun, moon, possibly planets, lunar phases, and even eclipses and the Olympic game cycles. But its complexity is astonishing. Over 30 meshing bronze gears with precise teeth, comparable to an 18th century clockwork in its sophistication. The unsolved mystery surrounding the Antikythera Mechanism is multifold. Who built it? And for what exact purpose? How widespread was the technology? And why? Why did it disappear from record? You think something like that would be well written about, right? It's basically a testament to the advanced Hellenistic science of its era, but it's also one of a kind. This anomaly raises many questions about ancient innovation and knowledge transmission. Decades of research, especially with advanced imaging techniques like X-ray tomography in the 21st century, have allowed scientists to virtually reconstruct the mechanism's gear trains and read tiny inscriptions on its components. So we now know that it could model the Metonic cycle, a 19-year cycle after which lunar phases repeat on the same calendar dates. It could also predict eclipses using the Saros cycle around 18 years, and likely indicate the position of the 5 known planets following Greek astronomical theories, though some parts are missing, making the planet display interfered. One dial on the back showed the timing of the Olympic Games, and another the Pan-Hellenic Games on a 4-year cycle. And this level of miniaturization and technical design was completely unexpected from antiquity until this find. It has reshaped our understanding, proving that ancient Greeks, and possibly their Greco-Roman ancestors, had the rather know-how to build geared mechanisms of great complexity. However, there's a few mysteries that remain. The shipwreck's cargo suggests that the vessel was en route from the Greek world, possibly Rhodes, to Rome, carrying artworks and luxury items. This hints that the mechanism could have been made in a known center of astronomy and engineering. Rhodes is a prime candidate, since the famed astronomer Hipparchus worked there in the 2nd century BCE, and there was certainly a tradition of high-precision instruments for the time. Hipparchus's calculations of lunar motion and eclipse cycles match some functions of the mechanism, suggesting his work, or that of his contemporaries, could have informed its design. There was also a mechanical tradition. We hear of gear-driven devices in the writings of Archimedes, who built planetariums, and maybe odometers in the 3rd century BCE. And later, in the Hero of Alexandria, that is the 1st century CE. Cicero, too, the Roman orator, wrote of seeing a device made by Archimedes that could display the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, which sounds very much like an orrery or a planetarium device. So could the Antikythera Mechanism be part of this same lineage? Perhaps it's the only surviving example of what was once a more common technology, often built of perishable materials, or simply lost. Or perhaps it was an experimental one-off, commissioned for an educated elite consumer. But of course, the unsolved questions include: who exactly designed and built it? No inscription gives it a maker's name. Some have speculated an astronomer-engineer like Posidonius of Rhodes might have a workshop that produced such things. Or it could even be a Roman technology learned from the Greeks. But given the context of the Greek inscriptions on it, it seems to be very Hellenistic. And of course, were there other such mechanisms? We may make a logical assumption and say yes, such skill in gearing likely did not just appear out of nowhere. Maybe simpler devices preceded it, and maybe even more advanced ones followed. But aside from vague literary references, we haven't found another physical artifact as complex until over 1,000 years later, where we find medieval Islamic astrolabes and European clocks. And this gap is quite hard to explain. It might be due to low survival chances of metal in shipwrecks, or that only a very few were made. And what exactly was it used for? Was it a teaching tool, a prestigious showpiece for a rich patron, or even a naval navigation aid? Most think it was educational or a gentleman's scholar's device for exploring astronomy rather than for practical navigation. Such dials include calendars and zodiac, implying it was to show cosmological information rather than just to steer a ship. But we also wonder why such technology did not progress further into, say, an industrial revolution in antiquity. The Greeks clearly had the capability for precise engineering, but such devices might have been exceedingly rare, limited by cost or a lack of economic drive to mass-produce such instruments. The mechanism likely had to be handcrafted by a master, which would be incredibly expensive. And with the tumult of late antiquity, including the Roman political upheavals and the later fall of the Western Empire, it is possible that the knowledge was lost or deemed non-essential. By the time medieval scholars were looking at Greek science, devices like this were long gone, surviving only in descriptions, and that's if the descriptions survived at all. And so as it stands, the Antikythera Mechanism poses an unsettling timeline problem. It's an outlier that suggests ancient technology was more advanced than previously thought. Is it a lone genius creation, or the tip of an iceberg of hidden Hellenistic engineering? Well, the ongoing research tries to answer bits and pieces of this. For example, reading the inscriptions on it has revealed an instruction manual of sorts. It names certain calendar cycles and cities, confirming what it calculates. But it also showed that the designer was carefully implementing state-of-the-art astronomy at the time. But we may never get the full story without finding another device or more records. Each improvement in imaging reveals another detail. Recently, they even reconstructed the likely display of the planets on the front dial via computer simulation. The mystery thus is gradually yielding some secrets. Yet the biggest contextual question just remains unsolved. I dare say it will do for quite some time. And there you have it. I told you were going to get some ancient Greek mysteries. And get them you got. So, before I go, I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Oh, do you hear the ambulance going by? Maybe you don't hear it. Hope everyone's okay. Anyway, let's thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neurona, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Cuckoo Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Caddy B, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, and Marissa. And that's it. At least for now. But I will see you in the next video, whenever you feel like coming back. Maybe you want to go watch another video now. Who knows? Or maybe you're already asleep. If you're not asleep, you better leave a comment telling me that you're still awake. Thank you for listening. Good night, everyone. As always, lots of love to you all, and I will see you next time. Farewell for now.